Support Narativ's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative and check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe and download. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live. Tonight, we're going to talk about Deutsche Bank, which, as you may know, if you watch the show a lot, we're kind of obsessed with because we think it's the holy grail of everything Donald Trump. David Enrich is the author of Dark Towers, and he joins us today. Hello, David. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. And as usual, Albi's in LA. Eric is in St. Louis. St. Louis. Did I say it correctly? And also in New York is Greg Oliar. So welcome, guys. Looking forward to this incredible hour we have planned, where we're going to try to figure out what you describe in your subtitle of your book. You call it Deutsche Bank, Donald Trump, and a Trail of Destruction. It's quite a title. Sorry?
An epic trail, not
an
just
epic
any
trail. Sorry, I left out epic. It is epic. It's kind of insane when you think about this long journey of this bank. Tell us a little bit, if you would, about, if you can, just a brief history of how this bank sort of went from started by the king of Prussia, and then some of the highlights along the way, maybe a couple of points from its history.
Sure. Well, so first of all, this is Deutsche Bank's 150th birthday this year. So happy birthday, Deutsche Bank. Founded in 1870. It was basically just a very provincial German bank helping German companies expand internationally for its first 60 years or so until World War II and the Nazis' rise to power, at which point it became the bank of the Nazi Party and the Nazi regime. And it helped finance World War II. It helped finance the Holocaust. It helped finance Germany taking over in large chunks of Europe, which so was very bad. The bank was found to be a criminal entity after the war. Its CEO was convicted of being a war criminal. And then in a pattern that has repeated itself over the years with Deutsche Bank in particular, but banks in general, the war criminal comes back, returns to grace, is once again the CEO of the bank, despite being a war criminal.
So wait, they broke the whole thing up, and then they reconstituted it with the same leadership?
Well, it was slightly different leadership, but the same guy who had been tried and convicted of being a war criminal did rise back to the top. And frankly, the amazing thing is he was eventually welcomed with open arms back into the Western kind of community. He was a guest at Dwight Eisenhower's second inaugural. And so he was really, he is the guy, Deutsche Bank was the bank that really helped after the war rebuild and redevelop a lot of Europe. So, and that was kind of the bank's story for the next, I guess I'm trying to do the math in my head, but roughly the next 50 years or so. And then this is again a story that we've heard before with different companies. It developed this taste for Wall Street, and slowly but surely all hell broke loose. And so by the modern era, it had become the kind of last stop for all sorts of people who had been, or institutions who really couldn't be banked anywhere else, whether it was outlaw regimes and terrorist groups or drug cartels or people, whether it's Jeffrey Epstein or Donald Trump. So, and which brings us to the present day, and that's obviously eliding a lot of their 150-year history.
Yeah.
But yeah,
wow, you did a good job there. So let's talk about Donald Trump, because he seems to have a magical ability to get loans from these guys, as much as $2 billion worth of loans. You said it's in 2 decades of working with them. That's a pretty impressive amount.
Yeah, it's not bad.
How did that happen? How does he get that good credit rating with them?
Well, I think to answer that question, you need to look at why he was off limits to everyone else. And the answer to that is that he and his businesses were repeatedly defaulting on loans and or declaring bankruptcy, and which obviously does not generally endear one to the banking community. And so he was, through the mid to late 90s, was really off limits because of his kind of final straw of defaults. And at that moment in the late 90s, Deutsche Bank was really making its big push onto Wall Street and into the US. And one of the markets that they really wanted to get big in was the commercial real estate business in the US. And so they were going around talking to big real estate developers, most of whom already had established relationships with reputable banks and had never even heard of Deutsche Bank, or had never, that's a slight exaggeration, but didn't really know Deutsche Bank, and why would they do business with them? And so Donald Trump comes along, who maybe, I don't know if he'd ever heard of Deutsche Bank, but he certainly was eager to hear what they had to say, because he needed a bank and Deutsche Bank needed customers. And so it was kind of a match made in heaven. And over the ensuing 20 years, the bank doled out in the neighborhood of $2 billion in loans. And the miraculous thing about that is not so much that they gave him that much money, it's that they gave him that much money despite the fact that over and over again, he either defaulted on loans or defaulted on debt issuances that Deutsche Bank had done. So this is not someone who came to Deutsche Bank and kind of turned over a new leaf and was all of a sudden a good customer. He was a very bad customer, and yet the bank repeatedly decided to get back in bed with him because they thought that they could make money off of him.
Now, LB has a particularly piece of history here, at least knowledge about his relationship with Ace Greenberg. And maybe you should fill in some of that as we talk about some of the pre-story to him arriving at Deutsche Bank, LB, and any other questions you have for David.
Oh, I have so many questions for David, but we'll just contextualize Donald Trump in the 80s. I think that's where to get people in their brains about him. And that Ace Greenberg was the head of Bear Stearns. We've talked about him quite a bit on Narativ before. And it's very odd for the head of Bear Stearns to also be someone's sort of private wealth manager. But he was for Donald Trump. He was always available to him and helping him. This was also during the years, just after the years that Jeffrey Epstein had been under Ace's tutelage and then got sort of ejected out of Bear Stearns, but was still working with all of the executives in his offshore stuff. And so when Donald started trying to do Atlantic City, and he was really set on Atlantic City, it was Ace and Bear Stearns who came up with ways to do creative bonds to where Donald wouldn't really own the bonds, but they were in his name. He could exercise them, but he wasn't responsible for them. If anything defaulted, it was still sort of Bear Stearns, but he had the right to use them to go out and try to leverage even more money. And so Ace did these extraordinary things and took extraordinary risks to be there for Donald, helping him prop up what would be his sort of Atlantic City endeavors, his casino endeavors, which eventually are what Donald pulled Deutsche Bank into as well.
Yes.
So
that's a really good encapsulation of it. That's frankly a better encapsulation of the Ace Greenberg Trump history than I've previously heard. So that's
perfect.
Yeah.
That's my era. Yeah.
So did Ace? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, and that meshes perfectly with what may be my favorite anecdote that I've ever encountered about Donald Trump.
Oh, it's so good in your book. Yes, tell us.
It's really delicious.
Such a movie scene, yeah.
And so the story goes, and look, I've heard this from someone who has direct knowledge of it, so the sourcing on this is very strong. So the story goes that Ace Greenberg is obviously Trump's banker, and Trump is basically in need of money. I'm not actually sure if it was for Atlantic City or for something else, but in any case, he was looking for something in the vicinity of $100 to $150 million. And he goes to one of the investment bankers at Bear Stearns, who takes Trump's phone call, not really taking it that seriously, but he hears him out. It's not a bad proposal that Trump is making, but at this point, the Trump-Bear Stearns relationship is kind of soured because Trump has had one of his defaults on his Atlantic City debt. And so the banker hears Trump out, and then, they hang up the phone, and he decides, listen, Trump will get the message that we're not interested if I just ignore him for a few weeks. And he'll just go away and get the message. So Trump starts calling back.
He never goes away. He never goes away.
I hope it goes away. I hope by November 4th he's gone away.
He's like an STD. Yeah.
Well,
get rid of it.
But you've got to kind of, I kind of respect his persistence. He's like, for me as a journalist, persistence is the name of the game. And so you try over and over again. And so that's what Trump does with this Bear Stearns banker. And the banker just ignores him and tries to make it go away. And it just so happens that then Trump goes and has breakfast with Ace Greenberg one day. And he says, listen, Ace, your banker is ignoring my phone calls. What's up with that? And Ace is like, I don't know. It's the first I've heard of it. And he returns from breakfast, goes into the office, calls his banker into his office and says, what is going on? I just had breakfast with Trump. And he says, you're ignoring his phone calls? And the banker says, yeah, I'm ignoring his phone calls, and we can make this go away if you want me to. It just means we're going to have to lend Trump $100 million. And Ace laughs and says, like, no way are we doing that. It's Donald. No thank you.
Even Ace was done. I was like, no more.
But it gets so much better because Ace says, no, obviously we're not doing that, but you need to resolve the situation. And we can't I don't want Donald calling me over and over again. So you need to go figure out a way to make this go away. And so the banker sits around and thinks about it for a while. And I've got to say, I'm not one who is really that in awe of investment bankers in general, but hearing this story made me appreciate their worth because the banker sits around for a while, thinks to himself, what am I going to do? Finally, he comes up with a plan. So he calls Trump back and he says, listen, Donald, I'm really sorry. I know you think I've been dodging your calls, and you know what? You're right. I have been. And the reason I've been dodging your calls, it's really rude of me, but it's because we can't lend you the money. And Trump says, what do you mean you can't lend me the money? I just had breakfast with Ace Greenberg this morning, and we're buddies. Of course you can lend me the money. And he says, no, we can't lend you the money, and here's why. Ace doesn't want us to. And so the punchline of this is Trump says, I just had breakfast with him. He is my friend. We can definitely do business together. And he says, listen, Ace told me the following. There are 4 people in the world who we at Bear Stearns do not want to be on the other side of because it's just too scary to be up against such financial geniuses. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, George Soros, and Donald Trump. And Trump didn't think for a second.
That is a very good brush off. That is very good.
It's $100 million compliment. The $100 million compliment.
Exactly. Yeah. Brilliant. Oh my gosh. And that's the way to deal with Trump, apparently, we figured out over the last few years. But there is this thing called Donald risk, which you talk about in your book. And, this is that no one really wanted to loan Donald Trump any money because he'd lost so much of it. And then he wouldn't pay it back. $700 million with the Taj Mahal and that group of casinos. But then in 2001, the bank did have a sort of a sudden, springing up of conscience and decided not to allow him this $500 million, $500 million line of credit that he had applied for. They denied that because they thought, well, yeah, they had a bad experience with Merrill Lynch and Taj Mahal. Then in 2003, 2 years later, they're back to doing business with him. Now they're selling stocks for the Trump resorts. The year after that, in 2004, they're funding the purchase of that Palm Beach house that we think laundered money for Bolovlev, the Maison L'Amitié. And then in 2005, there is a probe done of all their money laundering efforts, I guess. And there was some concern raised by the feds for what they were up to. And they were let off for some reason. And I'm wondering if there's any connection between all those things, whether, as we look at why they kept allowing him to loan all this money and whether the knowledge of the money laundering maybe was one of the reasons that they didn't press further charges or look further into it in 2005.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is I don't really know. I mean, I have a bunch of bits of information I'll share. It is worth pointing out, to my knowledge, at least, Deutsche was not the one that financed that 2004 Palm Beach property, which is obviously one of the, unless there's something that you guys know that I don't know, which is
I think it came out of the Wolf book, which I think was ultimately sourced to Epstein himself. But I'll look it up afterwards and share it with you.
Yeah, maybe I don't know. Yeah, there's but there was. This is also not mentioning another huge loan, which was they did the GM building for Trump around 2001, 2002. They did his big Chicago development in 2005, and so there was and the first thing to know about Deutsche Bank is that it is a mess. And one of the things that Trump I don't know if he exploited this savvily or if this was just by accident, but he did manage to exploit the fact that different divisions of Deutsche Bank not only were not communicating properly with each other, they were also often competing against each other, which is not a healthy dynamic inside a company. You do not want different parts of your organization fighting with each other to kind of one-up each other. And so Trump managed to exploit that very effectively. And so the unit that had sold bonds on Trump's behalf for some of his casino debt which Trump promptly defaulted on, didn't bother to tell another division of the bank about that default. And then that division of the bank goes and lends money. And so round and round we go. But to me, the biggest clue on Russia with Trump in this era is that around 2004, 2005, which is right when Deutsche Bank gets busted for the first of many times by the Fed for this Russian money laundering scheme through Latvia. Right around that time, I've heard, and I've reported this in the book, Trump was looking to build looking to partner on the development of a couple of big luxury projects, one in Baja California, so in Mexico, the other in Waikiki in Hawaii. And in both of those cases, he was looking, the way those developments get financed is you need a bunch of upfront money, obviously. And one way to do that is you sell condos or chunks of condos in advance. And so Deutsche Bank in London set up a bunch of meetings for Trump with some of Deutsche Bank's kind of high-end, very wealthy clients. And Trump and the Trump Org executives would go to these meetings in London and mingle with the guests, and in some cases sold not just one or two condos to these people, but whole blocks of condos to them. And my understanding is that among the people that were at those meetings that ended up buying big chunks of those properties in both Mexico and Hawaii were a number of very wealthy Russians with direct connections to the Kremlin. And unfortunately, I kind of know who they are, but not well enough that I'm actually going to say it out loud. But
it's a common story for Trump Towers around the world, is that there's a lot of Russian wealthy investors.
It is, but what's interesting to me about this is that the timing is so directly linked to when we know that they were getting in trouble. There was a major money laundering scheme that was going on where Russians through Latvia.
Organized crime.
Well, and there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the Trump Organization and in Deutsche Bank at the exact same time, and they link here at these meetings in London, and we see Deutsche Bank specifically introducing Trump to these very wealthy Russians who then put a bunch of money into these planned developments in Hawaii and Mexico.
I want to get into the laundromat a little bit later, but this is a good time to talk as well about Justin Kennedy, I think. And Greg, you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, can I want to pivot and go back to something that we were discussing before, just because I think it's interesting. The idea that, and this is something I learned from the book that it never occurred to me, the idea that when they lent the money to Trump in these vast amounts, they actually did have a business reason to do it, or at least Mike Offit's branch of Deutsche Bank did, which is that they had to have big commercial real estate loans on hand so that they could then slice and dice them and turn them into mortgage-backed securities to sell. And there's that great quote in the book about the furniture store. Can you just explain that a little bit? Because this is an important distinction, because people like me who don't really know that much about banking were like, where did the money come from? How does this happen? Da, da, da. Right. And I think it's important to make the distinction that there actually was a reason.
And this is one of I think to people who are looking at Deutsche Bank as the holy grail for all the answers about Donald Trump and Russia, that it ends up, I think, being potentially a little deflating, which is that Deutsche Bank had commercial reasons for doing a lot of this. That's not to say there weren't other reasons as well, or other money coming into finances, but they did have what they thought were solid commercial reasons for most of these loans. And they turned out to be wrong about a lot of that. But you can at least, and I've talked to almost all of the people that were involved in the decision to make these loans over the years, and they all might be lying to me, I guess, but I do think that there were credible commercial reasons for some of this. So initially, the loans in the late 90s and early 2000s through the commercial real estate business, and the hot Wall Street thing right then was the mortgage-backed securities business, especially commercial mortgage-backed securities, which means, as you said, it's taking big commercial real estate loans and slicing them up and repackaging them into bonds and then selling them to investors around the world. And Mike Offit, who was the guy running that business at the time, he's a protege of Stephen Mnuchin's at Goldman, actually. Mike Offit compared that to, and his boss got very mad at him about some of the loans he was doing, and he defended himself saying, I feel like I'm in a furniture factory or a furniture store and someone's complaining to me that there's too much wood. And basically that's the point. You need the wood, which are the underlying loans, in order to, package into furniture that you can then sell. And So that was the motivation, at least initially, for doing a lot of these loans.
So they needed Donald Trump's bad loans. They needed to give him a bad loan, basically. Otherwise, they would not have been able to finance all these others.
They needed any loan. Bad loan,
Right.
good loan. They needed great, big, huge real estate loans. Mm-hmm. And so you needed to be in business with great, big sort of development or projects, even if it's just someone slapping their name on it, right? There's a project behind that. There's a project around that. And whether it gets built or not, I mean, when can you start chopping it up? Did you find that out, David? Is it just as soon as the deal is struck, as soon as Deutsche says, okay, we'll fund this, can they start chopping it up before
I think it needs to
be laid?
Yeah, I mean, it's not contingent on the actual
development.
It's contingent on the loan, and the security is contingent on the loan. Look, this whole system is, I don't know if we can swear on this, but I won't be the first.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Encourage it, actually.
This whole system is fucked up. Like this is what caused the 2008 financial crisis. Our financial engineering like this. It's very rickety, and it's not built on often not built on a sustainable model. And so one of the problems is that you've got these big construction loans, which are very risky, right? I mean, put aside the fact that Trump has a tendency to default. Building things, even in a market like New York City, is risky. Like the unions might go on strike, for example. The foundation might flood. Maybe the real estate market goes south before you can sell the luxury condos. There are huge risks involved. And so, but that doesn't, the reality is these loans, the bank is going to hold on to these loans for not very long. They're going to very quickly package it, get it off its balance sheet, sell it on to investors. And the investors will either make or lose money depending on whether the borrower, in this case Trump, continues to meet the payments of the loans. And that is contingent in turn on whether he manages to sell the units, whether it's retail or condos or whatever, in the actual building. And so, and look, in fairness to Deutsche Bank and Mike Offit, and even to Trump, believe it or not, on those first batch of commercial real estate loans that Deutsche Bank made to the Trump org in the late 90s and early 2000s, Trump did not default on those. Those turned out to be good deals for all parties. And Trump certainly got what he wanted. The bank and the bank's customers made money. It wasn't until a little bit later that Trump started really taking advantage and defaulting and screwing Deutsche Bank and its customers in the process.
Yeah.
I think that brings up like point B, which is that Deutsche Bank also needed Trump the person because people in the United States weren't familiar with it. They pronounced it douche bank, like the guys that work there and stuff like that. And they liked having Trump's name on it and associated with it at the time because it gave them some sort of way to stand out, which I thought also was interesting.
Deutsche Bank was doing, it was really trying to break into the mainstream back then. It wasn't just trying to do investment banking. It was doing asset management and wealth management that are much more kind of retail-y businesses where you want to have, it's essentially the type of businesses you would be advertising with or advertising for. So, for example, they started hosting this golf tournament every September, I think, up in Boston. And they would get, it was a pro-am tournament. So they would get, some of the best names in golf, but they would also get celebrities to come and golf alongside. And so Trump was always a big draw at that tournament. They loved having Trump there. Trump loved being there. I've heard stories about him kind of working, I don't even know what it's called in golf, but like the lines of crowds around the golf course, I guess.
Sure.
And like
step and repeat. Step and repeat.
Yeah, there was this one incident at one of the tournaments where Deutsche Bank they were kind of doing promotional videos or filming promotional videos there with some of the golfers and celebrities. And so Trump, who can't ever possibly say no to a TV camera that's rolling, sits down to do an interview. And the Deutsche Bank person behind the camera says, "So tell us, Donald, why do you like doing business with Deutsche Bank?" And he says something to the effect of, "I love them because they're so easy. They just do what I want." And the person who was
they're so fast. They're so fast.
Yeah, right, they're so fast. Thank you. You've read my book more recently than I have. And the Deutsche Bank person filming this is like, is that actually what we want someone to be saying? It seems like that's not a great sign about us doing due diligence. And sure enough, they really weren't doing a tremendous amount of due diligence on a lot of these loans.
One of these days, someone's going to have to explain to me what happens on those golf courses, why these people pay $30,000 a year to be members of golf courses. What happens in those golf courses that are so special? Are deals actually made there, or is that, why they go there?
Yeah, I mean, I love golf.
Nobody's around. It's private. Right. It's away from the cameras. It's away from the phones. It's all of it.
Contracts. just make deals on the greens. All right, you're going to talk about something else, Greg.
Oh yeah, we wanted to talk about Justin Kennedy because he's kind of a key player in this for a lot of reasons, starting with the fact that he's the son of the suddenly abruptly retired Supreme Court Justice, the grandson of who, LB? Who's his grandson? Who's he the grandson of?
I think his grandfather's name was John Kennedy. I don't remember the first name. It's similar to one of the Kennedy family names. But he was the private personal attorney, singular attorney for Artie Samish, who was the Roy Cohn for the outfit out on the West Coast. A great big huge mobster fixer. And when he abruptly had a heart attack and he died, his young just what became Justice Kennedy was just out of law school, and he took over his father's sort of soul man practice, and then became a judge.
And then a Supreme Court
judge. That's another thing. I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, so he's even in the book, he's an interesting guy. I mean, the word that came to mind was swashbuckling, but what even right out of college, just doing all this kind of crazy stuff. So tell us what you know about Justin Kennedy and specifically the relationship with him and Trump.
Yeah, and so Kennedy, he comes from this family of, his dad, by the time he is coming of age, is a very prominent and fast rising judge, and the family has money. And so Justin's start right out of college or business school is that he starts doing a lot of commercial real estate, and he would a lot of purchases, and he would brag to friends that he in the 80s had bought up a substantial chunk of like fairly major American cities like Colorado Springs, for example. And that worked well for a while. And then there was a real estate bust and he lost basically all of his money. And he decided that at that point, maybe he would get into banking. And so he managed, I think mostly through family connections, to land an interview at Goldman Sachs and landed on the team of Steven Mnuchin, who at the time was, working in the mortgage-backed securities division at Goldman. And there, Kennedy met Mike Offit, and the two of them went from Goldman to Deutsche Bank in, I believe, 97 or 98. And at that point, even prior to landing at Deutsche Bank, Kennedy had run into Trump quite a bit. And they were both kind of leading these, I don't want to call them playboys, but like they were leading these lives of like swanning around places like Aspen, and you bump it. There's a fairly small world there, and so you kind of get to know the people, especially since they were both in the real estate world. And so Justin Kennedy is kind of Mike Offit's deputy at Deutsche Bank, and in 1998, and they're really starting to try and like build a successful commercial real estate business in the U.S. from scratch. In 1998, Trump comes knocking, and Trump and Offit hit it off, but Trump and Kennedy already knew each other. And so it was, there was immediately some traction there. And before long, about a year later, Mike Offit got fired by Deutsche Bank, and Justin Kennedy ascended to basically take Offit's role. And that left him not in charge of the commercial real estate business, but very high ranking person in that business, where he was basically in charge of figuring out, like structuring loans in a way that could be then sliced and diced into mortgage-backed securities and then sold on to investors, which is, that's basically 2/3 of the process. It's not the process that involves actually like looking through Trump's financials and deciding whether or not to lend him, but he was a principal on this who was in the room on all of these transactions. And during the period in which, so Kennedy was in that role for the next 10 years. And during that period, there was one loan after another, culminating in 2005 in this enormous loan to allow Trump to build from scratch, from the ground up, this enormous complex on the river in Chicago. And so Kennedy was, he was being wined and dined by Trump. He was visiting with both Donald and Ivanka a lot, because Ivanka was the person who was supposedly in charge of this Chicago project. And he became a close friend of the family during this period. And he left the bank in 2009 after incidentally having made a killing during the financial crisis. And went on and started and did his own work in the real estate business, kept working with the Trumps and also with the Kushners at that point. And so by the time the 2016 presidential campaign was underway, Kennedy was really, he was a very kind of tight member of the Trump and Kushner orbits.
I love this quote that you have in the book, which he says Kennedy sometimes sat with Trump in his luxury box at the US Open tennis tournament or at Manhattan nightclubs, where Trump would park himself at a table in the corner facing outward, holding court like a mafia don, which, many suspect he was like that. But it's an unusual optics to have the son of a Supreme Court judge hanging out with a mafia don.
Yeah, well, not only... Well, I want to avoid getting sued here. So just to be clear, I was not saying Trump was a mafia don. I was like a mafia don. But look, Anthony Kennedy he would sometimes come by Deutsche Bank's offices to say hi to his son, Justin. He would say hi to Mike Offit. It was not like that weird when the Supreme Court justice would show up at Deutsche Bank's offices. So Anthony Kennedy definitely knew what his son was doing. He knew about this big relationship with Trump. And so it was not, it was a little bit, none of this would have seemed strange, frankly, were it not for what happened in November of 2016. Right. And this guy that they'd been doing business with all these years, miraculously gets elected president. And at that point, I don't know what was going on in the Kennedy family right as he got elected, but there must have been some very weird conversations. And I know there were some very weird conversations in early 2017 when Trump started putting on this charm offensive to try and get Anthony Kennedy to step down from the court so that Trump could have another appointment. And he put on the charm offensive and Ivanka put on the charm offensive, really trying to butter up Anthony Kennedy by appealing to the friendship that the family had with his son, Justin.
I didn't know that at all. That's really interesting. Wow. And did Justin help with that? Did Justin put some pressure on his dad? Is that the idea there?
That's a good question, and I don't know. Not to my knowledge. What I do know is that, you'll get to this at the end of the book, and I don't want to give too much away for all the other people out there who might buy
this. Don't give it away.
Look, there's and Trump very famously I believe it was his first address to a joint session of Congress upon being inaugurated, gives the speech, and after the speech he goes through the crowd and is shaking everyone's hand, and the first row of people includes a bunch of the Supreme Court justices, and he walks down the line and shakes hands with a bunch of them, and then he gets to Anthony Kennedy and he stops. And when you see this on TV, you can't actually see or hear what he's saying. You can just see that they're exchanging some pleasantries. And it had been kind of this once Kennedy stepped down, a year later, I guess, people were looking back on that exchange and wondering what on earth they were talking about. And what they were talking about was Justin Kennedy. And Justice Kennedy said to Trump, "Great congratulations on the great speech." Trump replied, and I'm probably going to get a little bit of this wrong because I don't have it in front of me, but it was something to the effect of, "Thanks, that means a lot coming from you. And your son is just like a wonderful boy. We love him up in New York. My kids love him. You're doing a great job as a dad, and tell him I say hi."
I think he also said he was a good banker.
and Justin Kennedy was sitting at home in Florida watching this on TV, and could see the president talking to his father, and he called his father later that night and said, "Dad, that was cool. You're talking to the president on TV. What did he say to you?" And Anthony Kennedy says to his son, feeling like a very proud father, he says, "The president says hi to you." And that was kind of that was the opening salvo, and will become a weeks-long kind of charm offensive by the Trump family to really make Anthony Kennedy much more comfortable with the notion of entrusting the vacancy that he might create to this president who was kind of all over the map and was very hard to read. So I think it was a pretty important moment.
Eric.
Yeah, that part of the book jumped out. I was all over the stuff at the end as soon as we talk about financing, genocides in Iran and Syria and all that. But got sucked into the part of the 2017 when there's the interactions between Justice Kennedy and Trump a few weeks into his presidency, where everyone's on pins and needles. How's this all going to go? And what I think is so illuminating about your book here with all its great research is when you get all the contacts that were made between Ivanka and Justin Kennedy and Justice Kennedy. I just want to highlight for the audience how completely insanely inappropriate that is for the Supreme Court to be in touch with the executive branch that way and considering Deutsche Bank's history, it's and it's highlighted by all the rest of the beginning of the book, where you just see how dodgy all of this is. And the sentence sticks out. Trump was dodgy for Deutsche Bank, even given their other clients of Iran, Syria, the Burmese military. And then they connect through to they connect this dodgy, mobbed up, foreign-owned president with our own Supreme Court through the Kennedys. And it's just
smells bad.
It's amazing.
Smells bad.
Well, look, and don't forget the Kushner either.
It's a little smell.
It's a little smelly.
My allergies are going crazy right now, but I can smell
problematic.
it. I can smell it. Yeah.
Kushner's connection to all of this is fascinating to me too, because I mean the Kushners in a lot of ways have. I mean, look, the guy Charlie Kushner is a convicted felon and runs a real estate business that has had
in the Trump administration. It's
problematic generally.
It is generally problematic, and in fact, it made the family and the Kushner companies largely off limits to the banking industry, just like the Trump organization was. Until and the Kushner companies had one of the lenders they had done a lot of business with over the years was this very ethically challenged Israeli bank called Bank Leumi.
Oh yeah,
and they've gotten in a lot of trouble over the years. And
not Leumi.
Yeah, so. One of the people who went on, in fact, the person who went on to be kind of the most important person at Deutsche Bank as far as the Trumps and Kushners are concerned is this woman, Rosemary Vrablic, who is the private banker responsible for the Trump accounts. Where did Rosemary Vrablic receive her training on how to do loan underwriting? Bank Leumi. And so there's you can really trace the Kushner relationship and also the Trump relationship in the past 10 years through Rosemary Vrablic, where Jared and Charlie Kushner developed.
This is her, by the way, because people are watching. She looks very nice. Must be very powerful. Got some loans through for these guys.
She's good at her job, honestly, and she's
a great card too. I love that part. I loved all that color.
Yeah, she's fat.
She would drink booze with these guys and drink them at the table.
She's not.
Deal.
Yeah, she's not someone who you would picture in this role. She's a heavy drinker, and she likes going to dive bars. And then after going to the dive bar, she gets into her black tie event garb, whatever, their gown, I guess, and goes off and wines and dines with the richest, most powerful people in the world. And Jared Kushner, shortly after marrying Ivanka in 2009 and becoming part of the Trump family, there they are, happy as a clam. Kushner, who regards Vrablic as the best banker he's ever met, knows that Trump is in need of money and invites Rosemary Vrablic over to Trump Tower, where Kushner introduces her to his new father-in-law. And that's the start of the Trump relationship starting around 2011, because he had been kicked out of the Deutsche Bank in 2008 after defaulting on another loan and then suing the bank. He gets reintroduced to the bank and kind of re-accepted into the bank through Jared Kushner and Rosemary Vrablic, who has taken over the relationship ever since.
Now, there's also a controversial, I guess, thing that she's involved in. She was found to have purchased a property recently that she got from Jared, or indirectly from Jared. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, this is something we're still trying to figure out. We just reported this about 2 weeks ago, I think, and it wasn't known until then. So Kushner, like Trump, has to do an annual financial disclosure report where he lists kind of all of his assets and sources of income. And my colleague, Jesse Drucker, has so memorized all of his assets that when he looked at the latest one, which was filed late on a Friday night 2 weeks ago, this one entity jumped out at him, and I can't remember off the top of my head what it's called, but it was some weird,
it's a weird name.
It was it was like Burgle 715, I think it was called, LLC, and it turns out Burgle 715 LLC is an entity that back, I believe in 2012, 2013, sold Rosemary Vrablic and two of her Deutsche Bank colleagues, two of her subordinates at the bank.
So isn't that weird that she
bought her apartment, and which Vrablic then transferred into another LLC and then sold at a pretty nice profit a year or two later. And
I want to underline that though, that she and two of her subordinates at the bank together buy something from their client. It's clearly off the books. I mean, it's clearly not designed to be a reported transaction. and this guy is the advisor to the president of the United States, and she is both of their bankers.
Yeah, it's pretty weird. I mean, we called Deutsche Bank on this 2 weeks ago, and this was the first they had heard of it, or at least that's what they said, and they started an internal investigation into it. And we don't know what that's going to find. Look, to play devil's advocate, and to be just to be fair, I mean, it's possible that Vrablic didn't know that Kushner controlled or was a part owner of this Burgle 715 thing. It's possible. I mean, Kushner owns about $1 trillion. I know, but look, we don't know. And Vrablic, I don't want to defend Vrablic, but she was doing her job, right? And her job was to make and this is the story of Deutsche Bank. They're pressured to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. Consequences be damned. And she is doing her job to make as many loans as she can and generate as much fee income as she can for this bank. And the bank more or less programs people from the moment they arrive there to push the envelope in any way possible. And so she, like others, obviously she should be responsible and is responsible for her own actions, but she's also a creature of this completely out of control, unethical, often criminal culture at the bank. And so it's, I think it's
may not be her fault personally. Is what you're saying.
I don't want to cancel Rosemary Vrablic here. We don't know that what she was doing was improper. Well, there's a lot of.
I mean, do you buy condos with your colleagues? I don't know. I've never done that. It seems unusual.
I don't think the chancellor.
Yeah, we'll see what that.
I know.
Do you think that if the bank investigates her and they find some dirty stuff there, does that become helpful to the prosecutors who are looking at some of this stuff?
It's a really good question, and there's this whole kind of subtext to this, which is that Vrablic she knows where all the bodies are buried and then some. I mean, she has been concerned for a couple of years now that Deutsche Bank was kind of going to throw her publicly under the bus for all of the Trump and Kushner relationships, and she was so concerned about that at one point, I believe in 2018, she ended up printing out or photocopying a lot of the Trump and Kushner documentation she had, and she took it home and put it in her penthouse apartment. So this is someone who has a lot of ammo that I imagine the bank would be very concerned about if she were to just be a free agent. And so I don't know. I mean, to me, that was part of what was so interesting about the developments 2 weeks ago. It's not so much that Vrablic had engaged in what looks like a very strange, unusual transaction with what looks like a client. It was that the bank, without a whole lot of thought, came out and publicly said, this is news to us, and we are opening an internal investigation into what happened here, which is they've been very deliberate over the past couple of years to really be circling the wagons around her publicly. And this seemed like there was all of a sudden a good bit of distance between them. And I found that pretty remarkable, actually.
So Deutsche Bank has also come up in a couple of other things. We know that that Vance is doing some publicly stating that he's got all these documents or received all these documents from Deutsche Bank. Michael Cohen was out there yesterday with his new book, hinting as well that he can prove some of that tax fraud related to the president. What are your thoughts about where all this is going through the court system, and basically where do you think the prosecutions are going to land? Well, the last question, I really don't know. I mean, I think where this is going to land in general, though, is that, I mean, look, the district attorney has a bunch of stuff from Deutsche Bank regarding Donald Trump. We don't know exactly what that is, but we do know that the subpoena included, but I don't think was limited to, information about Trump's kind of loan applications and whatever materials he was providing to the bank as he sought either loans or other financial commitments. And so that could be all sorts of stuff. And we also know, obviously, that Vance, the DA, is and has been for a year now trying to get Trump's tax returns from Trump's accounting firm Mazars. And I suspect, I mean, that they have not yet gotten those tax returns. I suspect they will. And I expect they will probably pretty quickly, the way this court case is going. Will that ever become public? I do not know, because it's subject to grand jury secrecy rules. And will it ever lead to a criminal indictment? I don't know that either. I mean, there's what Michael Cohen has said publicly in congressional testimony last year was that when he saw Trump applying for loans or other financial commitments from Deutsche Bank, the unaudited financial statements that Trump was providing included asset valuations that were just
completely exaggerated and inflated. And that's very consistent with what I've heard from people inside Deutsche Bank who were involved in looking at these documents at the time, who said that they would, and he was just, the valuations were just preposterous. And they would go through and essentially mark down what he was valuing his assets at by as much as 70% per asset. So there was very little doubt that Trump was wildly exaggerating these asset valuations. I think what Trump will argue in his defense, if it ever comes to that, is that real estate assets in particular, the valuations are subjective, and Deutsche Bank, it didn't really take me that seriously. Having talked to lawyers about this, that seems like a pretty aggressive argument to make. And also, look, we don't know the full extent of what Vance is investigating. I mean, we know that it includes bank and insurance fraud, but for all we know, it could include a whole bunch of other things like money laundering and other stuff. So and Vance has been very and his lawyers have been pretty clear about that in the past couple of weeks in court filings, that no one, including Trump or the judge who's presiding over this, should be making assumptions about this being limited to an investigation into one thing or another thing. This could be much wider ranging.
Wow. Eric, you want to read a passage?
I would, because, so...
Let's hear a passage from your book, David. We're going to have story time now.
Because the story time starts on the cold morning of November 9th, when everybody, apparently including, according to this book's research, confirming what we all thought, which was Trump didn't think he was going to win. Nobody did, and especially Deutsche Bank didn't, especially with those ties that are mentioned in the following passage that might be revealed by the Manhattan DA's office. So this is: in the weeks after the 2016 election, executives hustled to devise a plan. One immediate step was to reduce the bank's exposure to Russia. A decade earlier, Deutsche had extended a $1 billion credit line to VTB, the Kremlin bank with which Ackerman had forged such close ties. That's, of course, a Russian spy bank that had been sanctioned for being Russian spies with Russia. Spy stuff. There was nothing wrong with the two banks lending each other money. Bank-to-bank transactions were the lifeblood of the financial system. But this was a large loan to banks with links to Russian intelligence, and Deutsche executives were scared about what might happen if it became public. So another passage that kind of frames the problem. Now, though, it meant that the incoming American president was deep in hock to a foreign institution, one over which his administration wielded enormous power. The loan agreements could be amended to delete those provisions, and then it would be the Trump organization, not Trump himself, that owed all the money, and you see all the contortions and whatnot. But David, I'm just struck by all these wonderful kind of understatements to this, because this book is like a large box of dynamite.
Yeah.
And it's all very understated and all very, very factual. And it's like, so they woke up and it's like, oh man, our ties to that Russian spy bank might really run into an issue with somebody becoming president of the United States.
Do you know, one of the things that I'm really surprised has not, look, I think understatement is better than overstatement in these days, and people can interpret whatever they want. And,
it's still an overstatement. You understate it and it's still like, holy shit.
Right.
Because you can't make this shit up, man.
Let me just tell you, though, that one of the things I've been really surprised has not generated more controversy is that, so from 2002 to 2012, Deutsche Bank's CEO was a guy named Joe Ackerman, who was responsible in large part for the rapid growth of the bank and transforming it not only into a Wall Street bank, but also just this monstrous institution that just did not give a shit about anything other than its bottom line. And that was a big part of the reason for the Trump relationship. It was a big part of the reason that it got involved in Russian money laundering over the years, blah, blah, blah. Well, Ackerman steps down in 2012 from the bank, and no sooner does he step down than he finds himself in St. Petersburg, Russia, at an economic forum organized by the Kremlin. And Vladimir Putin is there and asks to have a private meeting with Ackerman, and which Ackerman happily accepts. And in the private meeting, Putin offers him a job running the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And so if you think about that for a second, this is the bank that has not only been the bank to Donald Trump, but it's the bank that has been really responsible for it was responsible for the bankrupting or the financial insolvency of entire countries, like in Southern Europe in the early 2010s. This is a bank that is, deeply involved with the guy who's about to become president. And here we have the CEO of the bank, the guy who's kind of the architect of it in its modern form, receiving a very lucrative, very powerful job offer directly from Vladimir Putin. Wow. And look, the job didn't work out as it turned out, but Ackerman was ready to accept it. It's not so.
He wanted it.
Yeah. These banks were entwined. Deutsche Bank and BTG.
Yeah. It always strikes me that this all happened after the end of the Berlin Wall fell, and then the Soviet Union collapsed, and suddenly Deutsche Bank became a conduit for all this money to be flowing out of Russia, all this stolen money, $80 billion, as much as that, through the Latvian banks and through these other banks. But that Deutsche Bank was the vehicle ultimately that made a lot of that money laundering possible, and it did come right after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, look, Deutsche Bank has been in Russia more and longer than almost any other non-Russian bank in the world. I mean, it was in there financing railroads for the Tsar.
Right.
It has been in there, with the exception of World War II, more or less continuously. I mean, even during the Cold War, when Berlin was divided and their East and West Germany were divided, Deutsche Bank, the German bank, was in Russia. It was really the only Western bank in Russia, and the way that Deutsche Bank managed to keep in good graces in Russia was that it would do what rich, powerful Russians in the Kremlin wanted. And by the early 2000s, what rich, powerful Russians wanted was someone to help them get their rubles out of Russia and into the Western financial system.
Capital. It was all flight capital. It was like, how do we do this? And how do we get our money out? How can we put it in? And along with that came, Kremlin intent. You can't separate that because the directives were actually coming out of, use the word directives, the directorate itself. The former KGB, head of the KGB, was saying to his people, hey, find ways to go and create financial hooks into democracy, into the West. We need big vehicles through which we can push all this money into to sort of get ourselves out there, the way that Deutsche Bank itself as a bank had expanded, right? They were always looking, okay, let's go over here. We want to get into South America. Let's go over here. We want to get over to China. They were constantly, financial institutions that try to become global or do become global always want to get their money into other nations, into the businesses there, into the markets there. And so
this was stolen money. This was money stolen from the Russian
people.
Money.
Yeah, stolen money. Flight capital. So I want to talk about
Could David finish what he was saying there?
David, but I wanted to get Greg into. I want to get Greg into.
David, go ahead. Just finish your thought. You
I don't even know what I was going to say.
Okay, we'll forget about it.
They were very helpful for Russia and Russians, and that's what I want to say.
Okay, they were very helpful. Yeah. Go ahead, Greg.
Oh, what was I going to say? No, LB, you go. You were going to say something about the dead.
I didn't know if you had another question because I know you had.
No, I'm good for now. I have some
being so polite. I'll jump in. So here's the thing. There's a Russian laundromat from 2011 to 2014. $80 billion gets moved through all of this money laundering scheme. This all does seem to dovetail with the same time that people like Jeffrey Epstein and people like Donald Trump were in bed with Deutsche Bank as well. Do you see any connection between their banking and their banking with Deutsche Bank and the actual laundromat that was discovered between 2011 and 2014?
Just first of all, not really is the bottom line. I mean, which does not mean it doesn't exist. It means that evidence of that is very hard to find if it exists at all. And look, there were 15 different money laundering, get rubles into dollars or euros schemes going on inside Deutsche Bank, kind of at different and overlapping periods from very early in the 2000s until very recently. And the thing that unites all of them, and also unites the fact that they were doing business with Epstein and Trump at a time when no one else would, is that Deutsche Bank was willing to take risks and do business with people that were just completely preposterous to the rest of the financial community. And so, there's a reason that they were one of the few banks helping violate sanctions in Iran and Syria. Like, it's because most other banks were scared of the U.S. coming down hard on them, and so steered clear of it. Deutsche Bank didn't. And there's a reason that they were banking Jeffrey Epstein when no one else would, because of he was a criminally convicted, sex criminal. Like, there's no one else wanted to touch him at that point, or JP Morgan kind of did. But for a while, by 2013, no one else wanted to touch him.
No one wanted to do any work with him, and then suddenly they pick him up.
Right. And in some ways, the Epstein thing it's like maybe a little less potent than Trump, because Trump is president and Epstein is dead. But to me, the Epstein example is actually probably the most telling example of moral and ethical failure at the bank. And because when they took him on in early 2013 as a client, he was out of most of the financial system since 2008 when he was convicted of sex crimes, but he stuck around with JP Morgan until end of 2012, early 2013, at which point they too booted him out. And the fact that Deutsche Bank at that point, knowing a simple Google search would have very clearly identified who Jeffrey Epstein was and the problems of doing business with someone like him. And they just did not care. They went and did the business anyway. We now have an enormous amount of transparency into what happened there, because Deutsche Bank got punished a couple of weeks ago by the New York Department of Financial Services, which disclosed a whole lot about this. And they just did not care, like literally did not care that they were not only getting into bed with someone with a very bad reputation, but they were likely doing business with someone in a way that allowed him to continue his criminal activities, industrial rape, and to sexually traffic women and girls. I mean, it's really bad. I mean, Trump, look, no one thought Trump was actually going to be elected president. Yes, he had a bad credit record. Yes, he had ties in the past to the mob. But look, there are a lot of characters out there in the world who get loans from banks that do not have good track records and default on their loans. Epstein, though, really was in a kind of class of his own. And from a risk management standpoint and a reputation management standpoint, the fact that Deutsche Bank, as recently as 2013, was happy to get in bed with him, knowing everything that was out there, and stuck with him until last summer, right before he got arrested. Yeah. And that is just shocking. And its employees at the bank in the anti-money laundering division repeatedly raised concerns about this, raised concerns about him in general, and raised concerns about specific transactions he and his LLCs were doing. And they just got overruled over and over again. And so that's really bad. There's no excuse for it at all.
It's bad. Sometimes it comes with a powerful ask connected to it, right? And so this is what allows people or institutions to not care because there's there's a powerful ask behind it. There's some other kind of business that can come in because of it, or some promise made. I'm not saying that's the truth in this case, but that's the truth in a lot of these things.
It was definitely lucrative.
Right. It's lucrative, but also it's connected to all these other things. Yeah. If we want these other clients, then we have to do work with this client. And so, David, we don't know each other, but I'm a screenwriter. So in my industry, it's packaging. They literally package, right? So if you want this, and agencies will get in there and they'll reverse a package, right? So it's like, if you want this, you want us to put our talent on this project, then you're going to have to hire all these other people out of our agency. And if you don't do that, because we care about this client so much, we're going to fuck up this deal over here that you care about even more, because you're already $200 million into that project. And so it's a really
interesting point
thing that I just laid out there. But I find with money laundering, right, a lot of times there's something else hovering back there that we can't see, that's the ask that's connected to do business with this guy. And that's what allows people to release that, I don't care, right? Okay, let's do it, because then we get Saudi Arabia.
Well, I mean, we know that he was involved in human trafficking, arms trading.
Right. Look, it was a lucrative relationship on its face, right? Because they were charging big fees and they were charging interest rates on their loans. yada yada yada. But you may well be you might actually be hitting the nail on the head. And Epstein was the best connected sexual predator in the world, probably. And he had, up until the day of his arrest, had very strong relationships with a lot of very wealthy, very powerful people all over the world. And it may be that played. Yeah. So
and blackmailing some of them, we think.
Sense. It makes sense. Well, it's less blackmail. It's Deutsche is in the middle, right? They're the vehicle. They're the laundering vehicle, and they did this shit like mirror trades. I mean, they just were like, there's nothing even fancy about it. They stopped almost doing the derivatives and just saying, yeah, we'll take the money from this crime lord over here, or this terrorist. We'll just here's your real estate money. It was just this pass through, right? And it just all that I've studied, usually there's something else connected to that, where you got something that looks so on the surface, like how could you even ethically get past this? And you have people internally raising flags and saying, no, don't do this, don't, and then the guys at the top are like, yeah, you don't really know. Now, I know Ackerman was gone by that time, but I have a real problem with this guy. I think you did an amazing job with your book.
Thank you.
Really creating a villain. and there's also a love story in your book, which I think people should get it. It's a friendship. And I always look for this kind of storytelling, right? This is kind of stuff that really appeals to me as someone whose whole work is adapting. Not that I'm going to adapt your book, but I look, okay, where's my way in? Where's the human story in this? Where that the audience can connect to and we can follow it. And you really found humanity inside Deutsche Bank, which was almost impossible, right? With this friendship between the two men, and that it just ended in tragedy. Yeah. So I'd love for you to talk about those two guys really quick, because because Deutsche lost them, then it could just be Ackerman's foil of just money at all costs. Ends justify the means, just go, right? It just is the guy that works for.
So we're talking about these two guys, Bill Brooksmith and Edison Mitchell, right? Why don't you tell us a little bit more about them, David?
So, I mean, Edison, these guys both came from Merrill Lynch, which was this very aggressive firm that you guys probably all know, in the 80s and 90s. Deutsche Bank decided in the mid-90s that it really wanted to get big on Wall Street. And so it hired Edison, who is this derivative salesman, kind of a little bit out of central casting. I mean, he very charismatic, pretty impulsive, a real kind of visionary leader. Not one for details so much, but someone who was really ambitious and really motivated. And Bill Brooksmith was his best friend. They had both grown up in, not poverty at all, but in like middle to lower middle class America. And Brooksmith was the son of a Midwestern minister. And Brooksmith was like everything that Edison was not. So he was very cerebral, kind of introverted, very detail oriented. He was an expert in kind of the financial minutia of derivatives and really a pioneer of the modern derivatives market. He was an expert risk manager. And so he and Edison, both professionally and personally, just really like meshed together and filled in each other's voids. And I think they really loved each other. And they built,
their families came together.
Yeah.
I mean, it was sometimes in business you have a marriage like that, like real soulmates find each other and they're able to work together.
It's really, I mean, and they work together, but they also they spend so much time together out of the office too, and really knew each other in a way that I think is really rare. Even just taking the banking stuff out of it, I think it's really rare. And so they together, and Edison was the boss, but Bill was his kind of right-hand man. And together they built Deutsche Bank from nothing into one of the kind of leading investment banks in the world in a period of, not very long. And then at the very end of 2000, right around Christmas, Edison was flying home to his family in Maine, and he was in his own little personal plane, and it crashed into a mountain, and he got killed. And that was, first of all, I mean, that was the second death at Deutsche Bank of one of their leaders in a decade, basically. And so this second kind of decapitation of the bank really led to an internal power struggle that really unleashed all of the bad things that you see on Wall Street and in banking.
Yeah.
And for Bill, that was basically the beginning of the end of Bill Brooksmith's career in banking. And he retired for, I guess, 7 or 8 years before being lured back to Deutsche Bank by Joe Ackerman's successor, Anshu Jain. And so Brooksmith goes back to Deutsche Bank and is, again, like this leader in risk management. And more than that, though, he was kind of the guy to whom people would go when they had a problem that they needed help on and they needed ethical advice. And he really always had stuck by his Midwestern roots and the wisdom his father, the minister, had passed on to him. And he became known as kind of the ethical compass of the bank and the moral conscience of the bank. And he was involved in trying to clean up or deal with, in various ways, a whole lot of very shady stuff that had gone on at the bank. And Bill ultimately, and I think, had some severe mental health issues and really internalized the problems that the bank was having. And I'm not really giving anything away. This is public. But he ends up at the beginning of 2014 committing suicide. And so these two men who had really both been pretty good leaders, I think, in an institution and an industry that was really bad. They had stood out as kind of the good guys, I think. They had definitely made mistakes along the way, but they were good guys. And they both meet these just tragic ends.
Tragic ends. I think it's that Deutsche Bank really was so corrupt. It had always been a corrupt. If in your DNA is that you were the banking force behind Auschwitz, right? Behind death camp, worker camps, right? You're fucked up. I'm sorry. There's corruption in there in your DNA. That's like, right. And it did the environment, the culture, and Ackerman and his sort of, go, just make anything, ruin these two men. And I think because Mitchell, I don't know if Brooksmith said this, or I'm remembering this from something, and it was in your book. I remember this from something else that I knew of someone who I knew who perished in their private plane crash, and whose family said, well, the money killed him, right? Just killed him because he started living a life in a way that opened him up. Oh, I'll just take I'm not supposed to fly now, but I'll just take a plane now because I have a private plane. I can just get where I want to go. So that's what was going on with Mitchell, is what I got from your book. And Brooksmith, it was just, he got dumped into, the bank was in so much trouble. He got actually pivoted and dumped into the worst part of Deutsche Bank, where all Trump's shit was, by the way. And and there were federal investigations and there was pressure on him. And I don't know that he could here's a brilliant man who could sort of figure his way out of anything. I don't know that he could find his way out of that much corruption, that much of a horror show inside that bank. And anyone could. No. And it took him out because there was no escaping out from underneath that for him. It was.
Let's get Greg or Eric in here. Either of you want to go for a second?
I have a really quick thing, and then Eric, I know you have a question that you want to ask. I was going to say, just going to the history and the DNA of Deutsche Bank. I was watching Casablanca a couple weeks ago, which I've seen a million times because it's the best movie ever. And there's the scene, the first time you see Humphrey Bogart, he's like in the sort of casino room, and he's either saying yes, let them in, or no, don't let them in. And the guy comes in and he shakes his head. And the guy that he doesn't let in is like, do you know who I am? And he comes over and he says, yes, I do. You're lucky the bar is open to you. And later, like a minute later, Peter Lorre says, oh, I saw how you did with Deutsche Bank. And it's like, oh my God, that guy's from Deutsche Bank. Nothing has changed.
What's remarkable about that is Casablanca, I believe it came out in 1942. So it's the middle of World War II. Mm-hmm. And even then, Deutsche Bank was so synonymous with German military aggression that it gets this wonderful cameo in the greatest movie of all time. And there's, someone had told me about that, and then I actually I had never picked up on that until I started researching the book, and I went and
I didn't either.
Got the script, and it made me like that wonderful movie even more than I already did.
Eric?
So we've been doing a lot of understatement because this story all over the place, gestures broadly around universe. It's hard to make this shit up. So you kind of just plain old statements of fact seem like enough to tell the story. for one day, right? And there's lots of that, but I have some more conspiratorial thoughts based on some of my professional background. I come from the competitive intelligence world, helping corporations and some government type agencies manage risk, see opportunities, and reduce liabilities through an intelligence methodology. And one of the things that sticks out is when there's any organization that doesn't seem to have any sensitivity to the things that would make almost every other organization, and I don't mean small mom and pop shops, but like, steel foundries, pharmaceutical companies, billion-dollar organizations, tens, hundreds of thousands of employees, etc. They would go, Syria, the Burmese military, genocide? Maybe not genocide. Genocide sounds like it has some downsides, on the balanced scorecard matrix for the board of directors. Genocide's going to not look good potentially, so we would look at things a little less obvious than that in my field. And going through the book, especially once you get to the part where you're talking about the quote anti-money laundering unit at Deutsche, where they hired real professionals from other places that didn't have DNA that they used to. Well, back in the day, we used to melt down the gold from Jewish people's teeth in order to finance the Nazis. They didn't come from those organizations. They came from other ones. And they're looking, this one is going to this notorious oligarch. You should look at that. And that the Deutsche Bank people are like, it's good. Send it. And they're like, okay. From my perspective, that was the kind of thing that we tried to suss out. Like, how is this whole Bashar al-Assad thing going to go? Probably bad. How's the new Iraqi regime? Or, do we want to get mixed up with the Iranian, Al-Quds force? Do we want to? Maybe not. But these guys, every single thing is a green light. And they've got all these connections to the Kremlin. And I'm like, what makes you so cocksure that you're gonna bet hundreds of millions of dollars at a time on things that most people would blink at the very least?
Well, Germans never get anything wrong. I mean, that's one of one of their commitments to their brand, right?
It's a good joke, but I've had German clients, and they're the people that make it's like, no, you don't know. It's not 1, 2, 3, section 4. It's 1.0.1, 0.2, and that is why you trust them to build medical devices and bridges and stuff. So they're actually really anal retentive about risk, but not these guys who were the one dudes over there working with the Kremlin, and they're able to throw themselves into every risky thing possible and come out okay. And what's the one thing that separates them is Russian intelligence. I can't make the causality leap there, but reading around that, of all the places where they are risk intolerant, or rather risk insensitive, they're like, let's go, let's do it, it'll be great, and it doesn't destroy them the way it does everyone else. I go, is this organization a tool of a very powerful organization itself that has a lot of subterfuge and knows how to do things covertly? Those are the questions that remain in classified dossiers that I'm now really interested in.
Well, or the simpler and less kind of conspiratorial explanation is that which again, I don't know which is right, but which is that they were run by a bunch of essentially looters for a long time and took enormous risks that they should have gotten busted for, both by financial markets and investors, but also by regulators. And in fact, there was so much kind of ineptitude both in the markets and certainly by the regulators. And look, the Federal Reserve, has known about and kind of been slapping Deutsche Bank's wrist gently for almost 20 years on its Russian money laundering activities. And yet the Fed has not done anything about it. They'll impose these kind of pipsqueak penalties on the bank over and over again, and then wonder why nothing changes, when the Fed has an enormous amount of leverage over these guys. And the Fed, theoretically, if it wanted to really scare them, could threaten to revoke the bank's operating license in the United States, which would essentially be the death knell for the bank. And they have not, to my knowledge, done that. And in fact, talking to Deutsche Bank executives who have been in contact with the Fed over the years, this is going back probably 10 or 15 years, they were always surprised that the Fed didn't come down harder on them, and frankly thought that actually increased their risk appetite. Because if the Fed's not going to do anything about this, sure, we don't want to get caught. It's embarrassing. We have to pay a small penalty. But like, what is the real damage?
That sort of reinforces what Eric was saying, though. That sort of reinforces.
Why not? They're laundering money
It's-
for drug cartels. They're laundering money for gun runners. They're
terrorists,
starting
for
wars.
the
They're
Iranian
keeping
government.
genocide going. And isn't that what our Fed is supposed to shut down?
Yes, it is, and they have done a very bad job at that. Clearly, and the German regulators are even worse. And one of the interesting things, though, to me is that if you go back pre-2008, so pre-global financial crisis, you see a lot more banks doing a lot more like truly like evil geopolitical stuff. I mean, you have BNP Paribas, the big French bank that actively financed the Sudanese genocide. You have HSBC, which for a time was the world's worst. Yeah, and they were financing murderous criminal gangs, drug runners, and like very bad governments all over the world for a long time. What changes for the most part after 2008, after the financial crisis, and after the European financial crisis as well, is that these banks recognize that there is more to risk management than simply looking at financial profits and losses. You also need to consider reputational risk. And in part because the US had become much more aggressive about enforcing the law all over the world. And so you see at that point that banks like BNP Paribas or HSBC really pull back from some of the truly murderous stuff that they had been doing. And you see even JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs pulling back, which is why JP Morgan dumped someone like Jeffrey Epstein. And Deutsche Bank was unfazed by that, as far as I can tell, and really, like, until very recently, the past couple of years, has not even had reputational risk really as part of its kind of day-to-day vocabulary. And that's it's a missed opportunity to defend the institution, to not be looking at the reputational impact of these things. That would have kept them out of bed with Donald Trump, Jeffrey Epstein, Syria, Iran, Russia. I mean, they would have missed out on a lot of profits. But right now, we wouldn't be sitting here on a Friday night talking about how evil they are.
So let's just be clear about this. In your thesis, after studying all of this, you think that the ability for Donald Trump to be who he is today, to have become the president of the United States, was that enabled by Deutsche Bank? Could it have happened if it weren't for Deutsche Bank?
I don't know if it could have happened were it not for Deutsche Bank. It was certainly enabled by Deutsche Bank. And Trump was able to bounce back repeatedly from financial ruin because of Deutsche Bank. And he was able on the campaign trail in 2015 and 2016 to say accurately that he wasn't such a failed businessman after all, despite all of his defaults and bankruptcies. Just look at the fact that he has one of the world's biggest banks having a great relationship with him. And he trotted out that argument over and over again. And he was right. I mean, that's the crazy thing. He was right. And it allowed him to build some of the kind of marquee properties that he used as campaign props, in particular the old post office building, his big Washington hotel right down the street from the White House. And that's Deutsche Bank's money at work right there. The big Chicago tower that was a prop, the Doral Golf Resort where he wanted
that
to...
was The Apprentice. That was
but the interesting thing there for me is he's German, right? I mean, Frederick Trump was German. The grandfather, I don't know, that was Frederick too. And you've got a German bank funding a guy from German heritage who then assumes power in the United States. I'm not suggesting anything that was a plan or anything like that, but was he favored by them because of his German heritage?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that would be almost like too principled and patriotic for the bank. And I don't think they cared very much. That was what mattered to them.
All right. I'm going to feed Eric Garland's conspiracy here a little bit, because I was Googling around today. Look at this old picture of Merkel and Putin. They've known each other for a long time. A very, very long time. They're good friends. So who knew that? That's just a feed, Eric. He appreciates that every once in a while.
I'm not come on.
Ackerman had this, and look, I've talked to Ackerman about this in recent years, and his argument for why he was so cozy with the Russians is, look, and I think this is a certain amount of bullshit, but Ackerman considers himself more of a statesman than a banker. And his argument is that Deutsche Bank, as the leading bank for the leading economy in Europe, had kind of a political and almost social responsibility to help integrate Russia into
obligation.
Right. And look,
it makes sense. I mean, Russia is on their border. Right? They need a successful Russia.
That's a Rand Paul thing. That's what Rand Paul says. It's engagement. It's engagement. We're going to engage Russia. That's what
we say that from our vantage point in America, but the reality is they do share a border, and Russia and Germany have been at war repeatedly. And I do think, and that's why you've got pictures of Merkel and Putin like looking kind of chummy, what looks like 20 years ago together. And there's a long history of these two countries. So, I mean, on the other hand, that does not at all explain the fact that Ackerman thought it would be a good idea to basically partner with VTB, the Russian spy bank, over many years and kind of swap executives back and forth and swap money back and forth repeatedly and launder a bunch of money for Russian oligarchs. That is not, there's a limit to the explanation.
That
You've put the time. You've already put the dates on there because we got to go back to 2011. So about a couple of years after Obama takes power and realizes how much financial attack this country is under by the mob, by foreign intelligence, and Robert S. Mueller III comes out with Obama in 2011. He signs an emergency executive order declaring war, not on a nation, but on transnational organized crime. And he starts with the Vori Zakone, the Bratva, the Russian Brothers Circle. And then he goes down in Drangheta, the Chinese Triad. He's got his intel. He actually takes his intel briefings and they'll give them to him because he passes for a clearance. And so does his vice president and all that. And it's like our system has been attacked by a mix of hostile foreign intelligence and organized crime money like we've never seen before. And on 2011, they start shutting the pipes off. And by late 2012, after he's elected for a second time, the Magnitsky Act is passed. And then Ackerman is still ready to go take a job with Russia. In 2013, you can't be in that catbird seat. You cannot be in that position and know what money is going through your institution and know what money's being choked off. This is why Russia went for the throat on us after 2012. After we went for Magnitsky, causality, whatever, they went for our throat in 2016, and we ended up with their bitch Donald Trump in the White House. And we missed it. It starts with the cash.
How can we end on anything more than that?
It's great ending. It's a great ending.
But actually, if I can pimp the book some more here, I mean, it does, because the final chapter, almost like Rogue. If you see Star Wars. No, it's in there. It's not a surprise. We're all living through it. Rogue One, Star Wars, ends with, oh my God, they're boarding the ship. That's Darth Vader. This is the start of episode 4. If this thing ends with Glenn Simpson and Fusion GPS, and then it ends with, hey, they're starting to, what's up with Trump and Deutsche Bank? And ta-da, the aristocrat.
And so you should go and buy that book right now. You can order it on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. It's a terrific read. And sorry, go ahead.
It's terrific. And I just want to say buy it, right? Because I do know that, David, your book is, I think I looked at it. It was like, okay, I could get it free on Audible, which is great because that helps. Audible helps all those other authors and it raises the platform. But honestly, everybody, you got to support the people like David who are going out there and busting their ass for years and putting all this together and sourcing the hell out of it and trying to be understated so he doesn't get sued, but also so that it can't be poked at. It can't be weaponized, right? It can't be turned into a piece of propaganda, because David did such a damn good job telling the story. And you're going to get all these characters. You're so welcome. I so am impressed with what you did with this book. And so I want people to buy it. There. Go buy the book.
We are totally aligned.
Pay cash.
I agree. Second the motion.
All right, I think we all agree. It's a terrific read, and it's a huge
book.
Appreciate it. Well, thanks very much for coming on the show. Hopefully, we'll have you back here at some point, just to either promote your next book or just to chat with us. It's been terrific having you on the show, and I think the audience got a lot out of this. We certainly did, learning a lot about Deutsche Bank. The book is called Dark Towers by David Enrich, and thanks very much for joining us tonight, David.
Thanks a lot for having me. This was fun.
Yeah. Cheers, guys. Have a good night.
Bye.
Support Narrative's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative, and check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to subscribe and download.